Hello and welcome to another Hand Drink Solo wine info video where we review curious wines for curious minds. Today's curious wine is the Dornier Semillon. Now before we sip and swirl, we need to actually announce a little bit of a cast change because today's wine was made by the then cellar master Philip van Staden. But since then, as of 2025, the Dornier reigns have been handed over to the outrageously gifted and in fact sometimes embarrassingly awarded winemaker Toit Wessels. Now Toit seems to collect wine awards the way a toddler might collect bruises, which is to say incessantly and seemingly almost always without trying. Now, the reason that Toit is such a good fit for Dornier is because Dornier have always had a sense of Venus adventure to them, in the sense that they have a whole bunch of unusual cultivars that they vinify, like Petit Verdot and Pinot Grigio and Semillon and Malbec, but they make their wines in a fairly classic style. And that's textbook marketing 101, in the sense that if you're going to push the customer out of his comfort zone, then make sure you don't boot him all the way off the cliff. Or put differently, if you're going to vinify unusual grapes, don't do it also in an unusual style. And that's where Toit Wessels comes in. He comes out of Ridgeback in Paarl, which has this beautiful classic New World, quite ripe style. And he has absolutely perfected that polished, tidy, clean, and premium winemaking aesthetic, which fits perfectly into Dornier because that's what they've been doing for decades already. And for those of you who crave another analogy, Toit Wessels as a winemaker is kind of like maki, or at weirdest a California roll. Because when you're trying to introduce someone to sushi, you don't go straight for the sea urchin, right? You go for something a little friendlier, perhaps a little easier on the eye, like a California roll. And Toit, if nothing else, is easy on the eye in a winemaking sense. Easy on the nose? We'll cut that bit. Now in South Africa, Semillon may feel a little obscure in that it only really makes up 0.2% of the national vineyard. And even in a place like France, which is where it comes from, it's blended more often than not. And so it's kind of a grape that doesn't get a lot of airplay. But there was a time in South Africa when it made up 80% of the national vineyard, and it was so ubiquitous that it didn't even get a proper name. Farmers would just talk about groendruif or green grape because there was so much of it that everyone knew exactly what you meant, even if you didn't use its proper name. Now, we have shrunk down to 0.2%, but the 0.2% that is left in the ground in South Africa is more often than not absolutely superb. And it often comes from these centenarian, very old vineyards, especially in places like Franschhoek. And so as a cultivar in South Africa, the amount of awards that Semillon wins dramatically outstrips the actual area under vine that it fills within the national vineyard, which is all really just a long way of saying that if you're unfamiliar with South African Semillon and you happen to stumble across it, I can guarantee you that what's in the bottle will exceed your expectations. And on that note, when we get into the glass, perhaps just spend a minute or two with this wine answering that question for yourself. Does a cultivar that once had 80% and is now down to 0.2%, does it deserve oblivion? Or perhaps does it deserve ovation? Now, when we finally get into the glass to see what Philip prepared for us, we give it a sniff, and we get a really quite multifaceted nose. There's salty, almost salted farm butter element up front. Then behind that is some sweet but also tart notes of kind of like a grapefruit rind preserve. I guess grapefruit marmalade if you wish. But there's also a few other little accents going on. That savory element has a kind of doughy touch to it. So it could be a combination of farm butter. Usually it comes from the process of malolactic conversion, but then that bready element, it could come from the fact that there was lees contact in the wine. Either way, if you need a mental image, it's this beautiful brioche or farm bread covered in salted butter and topped with grapefruit rind marmalade. And then finally, there's something a little more unusual, something maybe a little bit of a spice. You might hint at oak spice, given that there is oak on the Semillon, but it's not a vanilla, it's not a cinnamon, it's not even a nutmeg, it's perhaps more cardamom. Now, let's give it a sip and see how that translates onto the palate. Well, that unusual note on the palate really does emerge as cardamom, but also almost like a spiced honey. So there's a touch of sweetness that comes into that grapefruit citrus and the salty butter notes, which I guess is almost akin to a kind of wild honey. What this definitely is not is that kind of Southern Constantia, Steenberg, greener style where it's super distinct. You have the most amazing explosions of lemongrass and perhaps a touch of capsicum. It's really got insane high acidity, far drier in style, far more distinct. In fact, winemaker Alunda Besson at Steenberg is doing incredible things with Semillon. But this is not that. This is richer. It's got a waxiness on the mouthfeel. In fact, again, it kind of feels like you start with the waxiness, the outside of the grapefruit, then you move in, and even on the palate, it starts to dry out a little bit at the finish, which is like the pith. But what lingers right at the end after all of that is that beautiful balance of tart and sweet white grapefruit preserve. So really quite a multifaceted wine, again, made with some of the comfort of a little bit of oak spice, some of the comfort of a little bit of richness on the palate, but a whole lot of other really unusual notes that make this fascinating to drink. So that's all we've got time for today. But while you pour yourself another glass, I'm going to leave you links to 2 videos, one of which talks about the Dornier Malbec, which is a really interesting wine where the baboons in the vineyards actually get involved as some kind of accidental green harvesting. Then the other video will take you down the delightful South African Semillon rabbit hole that is well worth exploring. So until next time, stay curious and always drink niche.